So moving on now to the drivers of health expenditure. Well, there are many, and these act on both the demand for health services and the supply of health services. So in terms of the demand for health services, we can start with aging and health status. So this is a relatively minor factor because we don't actually believe that aging will have a major impact on health expenditures, although it will be a major factor for expenditures in long-term care. But in respect to health status, we do worry about obesity, which is rapidly becoming an epidemic across OECD countries. We also have income, which is a major factor, and consumers' behavior, which is also major, and it's usually underestimated. In terms of supply of health services, well, there is treatment practices, which is major, along with technological progress and productivity. And these are also quite major drivers of health expenditure. And the main reason is that there has been a policy failure. There has been a failure of policy to adequately address these drivers of health expenditure. Now, as we heard from Professor Henke yesterday, it really doesn't make sense to try to restrict demand for healthcare because healthcare can be an important contributor to economic growth. And so instead, we feel that attention should focus on supply-side issues. So we need to get incentives for new technologies right, for example, by value-based payments. We need to provide more incentives to increase quality and coordination in healthcare, for example, by the use of pay for performance. We need to think about how to manage the public-private boundary, for example, by using health technology assessment for reimbursement decisions, and Professor Drummond will discuss this in more detail very shortly. And finally, we need to get a labour market that works, because wages have been increasing much more than labour productivity in healthcare. So fiscal sustainability is not just a short-term problem. While it may be possible to finance 70 to 80% of health spending publicly when health accounts for about 10% of GDP, as it does now, but what happens in the future if health spending starts to increase rapidly again, as we have seen through the 2000s? Well, then there are two possible options. First of all, public health expenditure will have to decline as a proportion of total health expenditure, or total health expenditure will have to be limited. Now, we see no reason to limit total health expenditure. So that means that the boundaries between public and private provision will need to be debated. And at the moment, not many countries are having that debate. So thank you very much for listening. And there you can see my contact details and also some information about all the data that the OECD produces, so please do take a look. Thank you.
It's becoming auto-regulative, please.
Okay, good morning everyone, and thank you for inviting me. I want to talk about the contribution of economic evaluation to healthcare efficiency. And I'll begin by explaining what economic evaluation is, then to talk about how it has been applied in the healthcare sector, then to discuss the outcome in terms of the impacts on decision making, and then to discuss some of the major challenges we face when we try to apply economic evaluation in the healthcare sector. And then finally, I want to discuss what constitutes good practice in this field. So first of all, what is economic evaluation? Well, this diagram explains it, that for a particular target patient group, that is a group of patients suffering from a particular condition, we have alternative ways to treat them. And the way this slide is drawn is that we have the alternative between using a new drug therapy that's just become available, or the alternative, which is usually existing practice. And then we compare the new therapy with the existing practice in terms of two things. First of all, the impact on health status, which we measure in terms of improvement in survival, or improvements in quality of life, or a mixture of the two. And we get that data, of course, from clinical studies. And then we also want to look at the impact on healthcare costs in terms of hospitalizations, use of other drugs, and other procedures. And in considering the cost, we have to remember that the cost is not just restricted to the acquisition cost of the new drug or the alternative, but of course, if the new drug is more effective, it may shorten hospitalizations and therefore cut other costs. Or if the new drug has fewer side effects, that means fewer other procedures are needed to deal with those side effects. This slide concentrates on healthcare costs, but we could also think of the impact of therapies on society more generally in terms of impact on expenditure in other government budgets, and indeed the impact on productivity if people are kept healthy or can return to work. Over the years, economic evaluation has been conducted in slightly different ways. The true form of economic evaluation is called cost-benefit analysis, where we would attempt to put everything into money terms, both the costs and the benefits. And in the early days of application of economic evaluation, we measured the benefits in terms of improvements in productivity, because we could easily put a financial measure on these. But generally, we don't invest in health to increase productivity. We invest in health because it's good for its own sake. So cost-effectiveness analysis would measure the costs in money, but the benefits in natural units, such as years of life gained. The problem with that, of course, is that it's very difficult then to make comparisons across different fields of healthcare, because not all healthcare is about improving survival. Much of healthcare is about improving quality of life. So a variation of cost-effectiveness analysis, which some people call cost-utility analysis, measures the benefits in a generic measure of health status. And the one that we use in Europe mostly is called the quality adjusted life year, where we adjust the survival gain for a measure of the quality of life. And in the developing world, they use a similar measure called the disability averted life year, disability avoided life year, where again, it's the same idea that we measure the improvement in health status adjusted for the quality of life. In later studies, we have also gone back to measuring the benefits in money terms, but nowadays the type of analysis depends on the jurisdiction. So many of the countries that insist on economic evaluation actually develop sets of guidelines for methods which those should follow if you're producing a study for the government or the health insurance. So how has economic evaluation been applied? A number of countries now are using economic evaluation formally in making drug reimbursement decisions. You can see within Europe, around half of the countries in the European Union, to some extent, would be using economic evaluation. In some jurisdictions, it applies to every new drug. in other jurisdictions, only selected drugs are evaluated. Also, we see application in the Americas, particularly Canada, and some countries now in Latin America, and also in Asia and Oceania. Australia and New Zealand have been doing this a long time, but also now Korea and Taiwan. So we can see we have a number of countries now following this approach. Now, economic evaluation in its formal use is usually conducted as part of a broader process which we call health technology assessment. And you're going to hear much more about that tomorrow. But the idea here is that the assessment would be linked to decisions about reimbursement by the insurance or coverage or guidance on appropriate use of health technologies. And usually appropriateness is linked to a notion of clinical effectiveness and cost effectiveness. So sometimes also the pricing decision for the drug is linked to the assessment, but most of the assessments focus on whether the drug should be approved for payment by the healthcare system. And typically evidence from the manufacturer and other published sources is reviewed by the authorities. And there's also varying degrees of stakeholder involvement and transparency of the process. And I'm going to return to that later on because I think it's quite important. So what is the impact in terms of decision making from using economic evaluation within the context of health technology assessment? Well, it can lead to a refusal to reimburse or cover certain technologies, but more often it leads to restrictions in access by defining more precisely which group of patients from the whole patient population will benefit most from the technology concerned. And of course, then there's the question of whether these restrictions are enforced by the healthcare system. And we have to admit that sometimes the implementation of these recommendations is quite difficult. Another thing which I think is important from the point of view of patient access is that sometimes the mere intention to conduct a health technology assessment can impact on the use of the technology. For example, in my country, our National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence does very good work, but it can sometimes take several months to do its assessment. And during that period, typically the healthcare system will not use the new technology because it's waiting to hear what the Institute determines as a result of its study. So I think it is important that these assessments are very timely. Our National Institute in England, we call it NICE, has done quite a lot of work, and we did a study a few years ago to look at what the implications were of the guidance that it gave on new drugs for cancer. And we chose cancer because this is an area where it raises a lot of emotions if drugs are not available. And also, it is a major function of the work of NICE in the UK. And what we are interested in considering is how much restriction did NICE place on the access to new drugs, and what were the reasons for those restrictions? And so the restriction was determined in terms of how much of the population that were covered by the license were also recommended for use of the drug. And this is the basic result, that in more than half the cases, NICE proposed no restrictions on the use of the drug. It felt that the drug could be used in accordance with its license. But you can see that in about 15% of the cases, NICE determined that for reasons which I'll explain in a minute, there should be no routine use of that drug in the British healthcare system.